We're always pleased to be back here at USC for our annual Ruskin Lecture and to be working with our friends here at Special Collections. This year, 2018, marks the 130th anniversary of the founding of the Ruskin Art Club, Los Angeles' oldest cultural and arts association, only slightly younger than the Shakespeare Club of Pasadena, as we have been informed on a number of occasions. The Ruskin Art Club is part of a wildfire movement, really, of Ruskin-oriented societies and reading guilds in the English-speaking world, and a signal contributor to the network of influential women's clubs in 19th century America. The Ruskin Art Club was organized officially on October 12th, 1888, in Mary Boyce's parlor off Pershing Square in Los Angeles. It's now a public arts nonprofit corporation and open to all, but it's useful, I think, to consider the serious, even revolutionary character of the club's original impetus, especially in view of tonight's topic. As Joseph Ryan's 1999 monograph on the club states, quote, "The founding members of the Ruskin Art Club were at the very cutting edge of a social movement that would carry the country into the 20th century. The movement took its name partially from the Arts and Craft Exhibition Society, formed in London the same year as the Ruskin Art Club in Los Angeles, 1888. The founding women of the Ruskin Art Club were not setting out upon a nostalgic review of art or a mutual admiration society of each other's collections. Their earnest study of masterful works of art promised to bring forth the beauty not only of what is seen, but is what is not seen. They believed that such a course, despite the mechanized society in which they live, would lead them back to being truly human. That challenge, of course, remains under even perhaps more daunting conditions. Normally, the theme of this annual lecture, either directly or indirectly, would be the thought of the great 19th century polymath John Ruskin, art and social critic, artist, philanthropist, pioneer environmentalist. But in the light of the 130th anniversary of the founding of the Ruskin Art Club in Los Angeles, we thought we'd focus this year on the history of LA and on the social and political context in which the Ruskin Art Club emerged at the end of the 19th century. Well, to help us unpack that history, we turn to an old friend of the Ruskin Art Club, the distinguished historian of the American West, Professor William Deverell. Bill gave us a remarkable lecture some 10 years ago on the 120th anniversary, and we've been eager ever since to find an occasion to renew that exchange about the 19th century city and how it shaped and shapes the city we live in today. Professor William Deverell hardly needs introduction here on this campus. Professor of History at the Dornsife College of Arts and Sciences, Director of the Huntington-USC Institute on California and the West, and also Director of the USC Library's Collections Convergence Initiative. His many publications include Whitewashed Adobe, The Rise of Los Angeles and the Remaking of the Mexican Past, Land of Sunshine, an environmental history of metropolitan Los Angeles, and the Blackwell Companion to Los Angeles. Lately, Bill has devoted his attention to, and I quote, to the amazing array of archival sources that are still in garages, closets, and in attics, end quote. So if you've got something terribly interesting hidden away in your garage, by all means, let Bill know. Professor William Deverell.
Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you all for being here. It's an honor to give this year's Ruskin Lecture. I think it goes probably without saying that everybody has something interesting in their garage, attic, and closet, and I will come look if you had something you wanted to show us. My sincere thanks to Gabriel Meyer and to Elena Byrne and all the others with the club and here at USC who played a role in putting on this year's commemorative lecture. And also, warmest thanks to Elena, right here, for hosting the lovely reception in her home last evening that precedes this event. Thanks, too, to Lynn Boyd Judson and the students of the Levin Institute here on campus for such a pleasant lunch today. Really enjoyable. So my focus this evening, or late this afternoon, is on 1888. And in that, this talk may sound a little like those similar historical studies that carve out a single year for special scrutiny, opening a door to broader analysis by way of what happened across 365 days. These used to be more popular, I think, but we still see them from time to time. They're the temporal equivalent to those single commodity books that remain popular. Books on cod, or salt, or milk, or cotton, many of which are written by Mark Kurlansky. As for years, we have books on, of course, 1776, 1968, 1846, the year in Bernard DeVoto's phrasing of decision. 1850 gets a lot of attention, a cusp at the far edge of the Civil War. 1919. 1844 gets some analytical care too, especially when viewed through the prism of religious activity, millennialism, and the like. Tonight we get time and place, 1888 Los Angeles. I don't want to just catalog events, though there's a temptation in that. This happened, then this, then this. Here's a picture, here's a map. The past is a different place. Let's go there for an hour. I do have some images, though, that I'll show you, all of them dated to 1888, to help us guide us to that past of 130 years ago in this place. Now, doing history is not rocket science, but it does come with a unique set of challenges. One is the lack of material from which to craft our histories. So little of what once was makes it through the chain of years to our times. We work with the whisper of time-traveling documents, images, artifacts, and memories, out of which we fashion our curiously flimsy statements of how things once were. So even though 1888 isn't really all that long ago, 2 65-year-old lifetimes laid end to end, it is long enough ago to be murky. It is right at that edge of the past that we have to look very hard to see it in our midst today, outside of libraries or archives. We can still find buildings from 1888 in our Los Angeles, but we have to look closely. This tangibility is fading. In addition, we have to fight two pesky foes in our historical work, adversaries that have a curious hold on the Los Angeles past. These are hindsight and nostalgia, and they're sneaky opponents of perspective. They are seductions, siren calls of simplicity and determinism. Hindsight knows how the story turned out. Hindsight looks for ways to map the route from past to present without contingency, as if those in the past could see the future and made their decisions accordingly. We'll do this way because the foreseen future tells us to. Hindsight reads the past in the wrong sequence. The now drives the then, and that's impossible. That bends relativity to expediency, and we'd best be wary of it. 1888 winks at hindsight, as it is a boom year in a boom decade, and hindsight wants the story to be all about setting the scene and the stage for what was to come. Perspective on the past by way of the present is fine, but we have to take the past on its own terms first. In other words, we can help explain 1888 by way of 1887, but not 1889. And what of nostalgia? Los Angeles history is tinged, sun-dappled, we might say, by this one. That's citrus crate label history. Lush, brightly hued, fertile, exotic, even tinged with the erotic. The land of sunshine. Open space, pregnant with possibilities, and sumptuous. We'd best be careful here, too. Nostalgia and its sibling romance are powerful makers of historical tidiness. Look what they did to Helen Hunt Jackson and her novel Ramona. Within just a couple years of its publication, and certainly by 1888, the muckraking indictment of federal Indian policy had become instead a twilight-sheened tourist come-on. What had tried to be brash ended up as a forged and sweetly poignant narrative of place and history, one perfectly fashioned by its reception into a proto-cinematic tale that explained this place to itself with Victorian melodrama laid over genocidal truths. The 1880s is alchemic for this, and as our vision of this 130-year-old past fades ever from view, we have to resist the easy attractions of soothing romance. Now, brash is a malleable word. On the one hand, it can mean energetic and vibrant in a non-judgmental or praising way, bold and innovative. On the other, it smacks of arrogance and even vulgarity. And then there's the tinge of adolescence here, a teenager's certainty about the ways of the world and one's place in it. I speak from experience. 1888 Los Angeles has all of this. It's a city of about 50,000 people at that moment. It had grown nearly fivefold in a decade, and those who championed the place were feeling their and its oats. It had come from little, it had come through a cauldron of violence and war, and by 1888, the place and its champions had set their eyes and their rudders on a brash course for the future. These are a people still dwarfed by the size of the basin they're in and by the mountains that tower over and around it. They're hunkered near the Los Angeles River, for the obvious reason that the river is the chief water supply and will remain so for another generation. But we can also talk big amidst the small, because Angelenos of the era are starting to puff out their chests and talk big. Los Angeles in 1888 was, if modest, already a complex place with a complex history, and even then it exhibited hints of what it might become. Brash Los Angeles was, even then, an ironic place, though. Shot full of dreams and of disappointments, of justice triumphant and denied, of startings over and of sad endings. And it was certainly a place on the make. America and the world came to be renewed in Los Angeles, to be revived, emotionally, spiritually, economically, physically, physiologically. And of course, the world yet comes for all those reasons and more. A young woman came here in 1888 from Maine. Even these many years later, her exuberance gives shape to the brashness of the place. I wonder if any power of words could properly depict the beauties of Los Angeles, she wrote. I had heard about it, read about it, and thought that I was prepared for it. But it all smote upon my eyesight like a revelation, and I still wonder, and still the wonder grows, and never once have I sallied forth from the pretty street where I have my abiding place, that my lips have not poured forth a series of rapturous exclamations. Now, I like Los Angeles, but I've never thought it in those terms. Now, Los Angeles 130 years ago is surely a place of velocity. 1888 Los Angeles is hardly a generation removed from its earlier life as a Mexican possession, and hardly a generation from there back to the Los Angeles of Spanish imperial and ecclesiastical designs on the faith and the labor of the indigenous peoples here. There's a seam here in 1888 between what was and what would be. Every year has that seam, of course, but this one seems more palpable to me. There's a rural and even pre-modern landscape and culture tugging at a metropolitan future, or vice versa. Horizontal LA versus a vertical LA, agricultural versus an urban and suburban LA. We can see, if we look closely, being wary of hindsight, the coming of the 21st century, just as we can see a much, or 20th century, just as we can see a much earlier era still expressing its influence. We have to remember that 19th century Americans are a deeply agricultural people, a livestock and farming people. This is an image from captioned Los Angeles, 1888. If we could go back in time to 1888 Los Angeles, we would be astounded, I think, by the prevalence of the horse. And if, in contrast, if we brought someone from 1888 back with us to 2018, one of the first questions they'd ask us is, what have you done with all the horses? Again, another caption, farming family, 1888 Los Angeles. I'd love to know where this is, but I don't. But we can see that horse and mule and cattle and oxen past, giving way. Both urban and suburban ethos are rising in 1888 and beginning to transform the landscape in remarkable ways, tugging threads loose from that rural past. So simultaneous imagery from 1888 to these are images like this. The ever-present, ever-prevalent bird's eye maps of a suburban landscape future where I think there are probably horses in there, but they're almost afterthoughts. They start to disappear from the landscape in this way. Replaced by a stag on this one. Historians refer to the period we're interested in today as the boom of the 80s. And they were booming times. Demographic expansion, economic diversification, ambitious spatial growth, and the challenges created by all marked the period. They were exciting times, and no one paying attention could fail to miss that fact. We do well to remember the civic optimism of the era, part of which, aimed directly at the rapid maturation of the city in matters intellectual and artistic, was the founding of the Ruskin Art Club, at a really remarkable edge of engagement with arts, culture, and politics here in the far West Coast. It must have been good to be in Los Angeles of that moment and to try to lay the foundation for art and culture in an ambitious metropolis on the make. Just as it's good to be here these 100+ years later and still have the Ruskin Club with us. Now, how does Los Angeles get on the map of American and world consciousness in the late 1880s? Many ways, of course, and the word gets out, as our young woman from Maine reminded us. She'd heard of Los Angeles, she read about it, but nothing could prepare her for being here. One of the ways that Los Angeles gets on the map is literally by way of maps, and the connection from maps particularly to railroads, and railroads using maps to advertise the places that they wanted people to come settle or be tourists in, or send goods to and from market on the railroads. So railroads are undeniably woven into the PR juggernaut that advertises LA to the world. They themselves are related to cheaper paper construction and manufacture, and the rise of certain printing and four-color lithography and other printing techniques, and the cheapening costs of those. Inevitably, here in Los Angeles, paper imagery, word imagery gets us to the power of the Los Angeles Times, which is a significant booster player on the landscape, already very prominent by the late 1880s. Similarly, the postal rates are going down. As postal rates go down and cheap printing techniques allow for printing on paper cheaper, the penny postcard rises in prominence, and that's accompanied by cheaper photographic techniques that can lay photographs atop any manner of printing materials and get the word out. Kodak develops a cheap box camera, democratizing and feminizing photography in 1888. And that camera begins to send out, by the millions, images of vernacular and candid and prosaic photography, often of which is aimed at the Los Angeles of that era. The markers of this change were everywhere. The Chamber of Commerce in Los Angeles began its rise to power and prominence at its founding in 1888. Already alongside the increasingly influential, as I mentioned, LA Times. Water course and water supply manipulation, already tried and true in Los Angeles of the late 18th century forward, is increasing, either through American embrace of the old Zanja system of watercourse ditches or through the city's efforts at municipal water storage and ownership. Here's an 1888 image. It's blurry, I apologize, but that's a Zanja running through what's now Pershing Square, a major watercourse out of which would be cut additional watercourses to water a variety of things from it. Now, there's a liveliness to the era that rings yet loudly in its language. If excessive, often hyperbolic exuberance, almost as if everyone is shouting at one another in 1888. We need to listen to those, of course, but we also need to listen to the stories beneath all that shouting. We need to hear what's being drowned out. The boom of the 80s is all about the iron horse supplanting the mammal horse, first with the Southern Pacific in 1876, and then later in the 1880s with the Santa Fe and the coming of rival lines. Competition between rival companies drove fares down. The railroads are very ambitious about spreading the visual and word imagery of the place. And a country on the move discovered Los Angeles, just as Los Angeles discovered a nation of newly middle-class people, ready to travel, perhaps ready to move, doing something that before had been reserved really only for the very wealthy, and that is being a tourist or taking a vacation. The boom of the 80s was also about busts. It's not an ever-present boom forward, and we do well to remember that. The real estate frenzy of the period was every bit an economic bubble, but for all intents and purposes, it just kept getting blown back up again every time it fizzled or popped, which it does. That's capitalist bread and butter of boom and bust and boom and bust, with all the exclamations born of both. But the attractions of the place, its push and pull magnetism, could not be denied. Specific themes call to us from that period, and they're probably familiar to all of you as they're familiar to my students today, most of them. Not most of the students, most of the themes. The climate, of course the climate, and it still reverberates with our undergraduates who come from afar to come here. Americans in the 19th century are cold. They're trained to be cold by the origin stories of the American Revolution, by Trenton and Princeton, by Valley Forge, by Puritans freezing in the winters of the 17th and 18th century. They're culturally trained to think of America as a cold place. They'd only really been in California since just before the gold rush. And even then, they hadn't come south here to Los Angeles or Southern California all that much. When they do, they're astonished at how warm they are. We have in special collections postcard after postcard after postcard written from the late 1880s from visitors here who inevitably, the first line of the postcard that they're sending home to loved ones is about the weather. And I think we oftentimes make fun of that or think it's just sort of trite or even silly. And I think we need to realize how astonished they are about it and how attractive they find it. No wonder by the latter 19th century that these visitors start ever so slowly to hang out at the beach. They don't yet swim, and they don't yet show their skin very much at all. But the juggernaut is moving towards the embrace of the beach by the early 20th century, as in many respects the sunshine spot of Southern California. Important, too, is that people who come here oftentimes view the sun in virtually antiseptic qualities. They view it as health-giving in ways that we have a little memory of, but we've kind of sunscreened it out of our memory. They really believe in the antiseptic quality of the sunshine. There's an organic dimension to this story of exuberance, a place where urban history kind of meets photosynthesis. Boosters, tourists, and settlers alike threw open their arms and hugged the Los Angeles sunshine, turning the region into what they so often called a semi-tropic paradise, a city with its back to the desert and its face warmed by the sun dropping into the Pacific. The paraphernalia and cultural offshoots of climate soon began to play an even greater role in the creation of what we today, but they don't just yet, call a regional lifestyle. This is exemplified by the far west fascination, Southern California in particular, with exotic plants, especially the palm, the yucca, pampas grass, the succulents, and the cacti, and the astonishing array of fruit that they never fail to comment upon. Early migrants to Southern California just prior to the Civil War will often utilize the cactus and the succulents as their ornamentation in their yards or even their fencing, and they'll do drought-tolerant plantings well before they learn how to put grass in. So we're coming back to the future now with drought-tolerant landscapes. And of course, there's the push and pull of health factors, hopes and fears tied in some respects to that antiseptic sun. They come here if they're sick. They come here because the place is seen as a place to regain your health. They come here because of the absence in 19th century language of miasmas, of humors in the air. They come here because of tumors, because of tuberculosis and respiratory disease. They come here because of the aridity. They come here because the booster maps claim that there's no malaria, no cholera, no contagious disease. Ironies, given the recent history that we now know of the missions as tremendously unhealthful places, in essence, gracefully arched immunological killing fields, which have been, the landscape has been reverberated or changed within a generation to be one that supposedly is filled with health-giving properties. I think we've got to put pulmonary distress on the list of reasons why Los Angeles grows the way it does, or respiratory distress. The 19th century called them, in moments lacking sympathy or pity, lungers. And they're all over Los Angeles by the late 1880s, answering doctors' orders to get themselves to altitude or dry air in usually fruitless efforts to stave off respiratory trouble of one sort or another. We'd see a lot of horses if we went back in time, but we'd also hear a lot more coughing than we're accustomed to in our era of antibiotics and polite prohibitions against spitting. Many a contemporary bed and breakfast or mansion in the foothills of the San Gabriel Mountains started out as a sanitarium, catering to a sad clientele, hoping that the Los Angeles sunshine and air had curative powers beyond the reach of medicine. If we think about it for a minute, there's a poignant LA irony lurking here, one that I'm surprised hasn't been taken up more often by the fiction or film communities. There's one Los Angeles bursting at the 1880s seams with adolescent energy, youthful, even sensuous, optimistic, world-beating, and another Los Angeles of precisely the same moment, cloistered behind contagion's walls, downcast, tired, sick, coughing, lonely, desperate, dying. What has made it from then to now in our landscapes more than anything else in our midst are our cemeteries that date back from that era. Now that said, the healthful exuberance was louder and more out in the open. The prosperity of Los Angeles is founded on the immutable forces of nature, one 1888 publication declared, and another offered the odd boast that Los Angeles had never seen sunstroke nor mad dogs, which I take must be a reference to rabies, in which case neither assertion was true, but it didn't really matter. There's another convalescent theme here, as fervent or as desperate as anything rattling in the lungs. Americans migrated here to get away from the recent horrors and heartaches of the Civil War, the end of which, we ought to remember, was as recent to them in 1888 as 1995 is to us, to abandon and to forget the fields of death. In this regard, a Western attempt to answer Abraham Lincoln's call in his second inaugural to bind up the nation's wounds. Los Angeles, I think, is the most important city in the most important post-Civil War state in the nation. Remember that in per capita quantities, if the Civil War would be fought today, it would kill 7 million of us. Los Angeles could be, in the hopes of many, a redemptive place in the face of those horrors. That landscape of healing reached out in imagination, if not reality, to those scarred by the war. The Soldiers' Home in Westwood opened in 1888. There it is. Magnificent structures of dormitories and cafeterias and libraries and lyceums and athletic fields, but a pretty desperate place as well. Immediately becomes a tourist attraction on the trolley line for people to go out and see the veterans of the war at the VA home. Home only to Union soldiers. The reunion of the war did not reach out in the convalescent capacity to veterans of the Confederacy. Back to what we'd see if we went back in the past. We'd see those horses, we'd hear the coughing, and if we were in Westwood, it would be impossible to miss the sight of the Union Army's amputees. There's the grounds of the Westwood VA. Quite a magnificent place, still a magnificent place, and with an archive that takes a little work to dig into, but there's a lot of material there. A redemptive faith in this place could be millennial, too. Los Angeles is a place for religious exuberance and enthusiasms. Isn't a product of recent televangelism or Amy Semple McPherson. It's much older than that. Of course, we can look factor the missions into that in some respect. We can find it in the late 19th century as well. 1888 has its share of world-beating or world-ending shamans of this or that faith, established or otherwise. And it is the late 1880s that launched Los Angeles into the social gospel enthusiasms of fin de siècle LA. People come because it's exotic, or just exotic enough. They come because it has a lot of promises, most of which will probably remain unfulfilled. They come because it's supposedly semi-tropic, which is a climatological or cultural category that doesn't really exist. It's made up. It's either tropical or it's not. Semi-tropic oftentimes seems to be a placeholder for We got the right weather, we just don't have a lot of the natives. Here, too, rising in the late 1880s is the Spanish fantasy past. That's a love affair with the mission period and Father Serra stripped of strife. You can see it starting to generate real energy in the late 1880s. Brick and adobe dancing around one another as building blocks of a muscular future and mud reminders of a distant past. Before you know it, the missions are ruins of noble aims, and Father Serra is the adobe founding father on his sandaled way eventually to sainthood. But again, what's the brashness shouting over? What do we not hear? For there are struggles and obstacles aplenty. When all is said to be bright and sunny, what's unseen? Here's a familial rendering of the Spanish fantasy past. This is downtown LA, 1888. This is the Ibarra family. Kind of caught probably in a California space and place of probably bygone financial glory, but still social status. One of the challenges is, could this place transition smoothly and lastingly from the pastoral to the industrial, yet with some supposed sustenance of a supposed special harmony with nature? Not only do 1880s Angelenos say they can, they make a bold argument, a brash argument, that Los Angeles is unlike any other city in America, even the most boisterous of them, even in history. It is, they say, nature's workshop. That embrace, a slogan, is formulated here in the 1880s. And it's a naive faith that urban and rural could be a suburban ideal, that industrial and nature could form some kind of Edenic Venn diagram that crossed over, and the overlap was Los Angeles. That vision from the late 1880s is also crisscrossed and tied into a package by trolley lines that supposedly adhere on the landscape the distance between nature and the city in suburban idyll. Another issue arises in the racial geography of the region's political economy, and it becomes telling in the 1880s. And that's an attraction to Asia. After all, what is the Transcontinental Railroad that arrives here just before the decade of the 80s? What is that but an iron Northwest Passage? What are the late 1880s Los Angeles harbor dreams, reaching across the Pacific, of railroad titans, to be realized in the 1890s? What are those other than ancient promises of the seductions of the Orient coming true? It's powerfully dissonant, cognitively and culturally, to be attracted to Asia in the 1880s as a goal of commerce, but to make simultaneously of Los Angeles the nation's premier anti-Asian actor in U.S. politics and law and interpersonal violence. Remember that the 1888 Scott Act expanded the Chinese Exclusion Act of a few years earlier, and this was built here at least, atop the largest massacre of Chinese in United States history in downtown LA in 1871. And what of the poignant irony, we're not there yet in 1888, but we will be, what of the poignant irony laden in the eventual destruction of this Chinatown, this is Old Chinatown, 1888, to make way for eventually Union Station by the end of the 1930s. This is Old Chinatown as well in 1888, somewhere where the tracks of Union Station now cross behind the depot. It's brash to believe in and superintend blatant racial segmentation out of a brash pride in this place as some kind of exclamation point for Anglo-Saxon existence. The 1880s is filled with that kind of language. Begun rudely in a dank police courtroom in the 1880s, the Historical Society of Southern California went about its work in earnest. Save everything, the Society's president urged the membership, at least everything that could establish a physical record that the 1880s were important. In other words, save everything of that decade, not behind it. The 1880s were seen as the AD decade atop the precursor BC past. Don't concentrate too hard on the earlier periods, the Society official urged. After all, the future did not belong to the people of those earlier years. They'd lost in the blood sports of war and commerce, and thus deserved their place as quaint occupants of the past. As the organization's president wrote, "A score or two of names, a few crumbling adobes, and all is told." Kind of a curious foreclosure for a historical society. Another publication of the era addressed the issue more crudely. In the words of this one, the, quote, "very scum of Mexico had founded Los Angeles." Why then celebrate that past if you bigotedly believed it to be as stated, except through the soothing strains of make-believe and romance, then gaining such powerful cultural momentum? The point is not a subtle one, especially for a supposed historical body, and it invites us to examine the transitions of the late 1880s every bit as closely as those of the 1850s, when Los Angeles shuddered from the violence produced by its sudden change in nationality. By 1888, with the real estate boom and swelling population of Anglo-Aravistes, the usable past had started to be hitched almost entirely to its commercial potential. What had once been sleepy and denigrated was now attractive, at least commercially, even mysterious, worthy of contemplation and sale. Now comfortably Americanized, Los Angeles began to mine that past, burnished of any edges. "The City of the Angels is a prosperous city now," wrote Helen Hunt Jackson. "It has business thoroughfares, blocks of fine stone buildings, hotels, shops, banks, and is growing daily. Its outlying regions are a great circuit of gardens, orchards, vineyards, and cornfields. Its suburbs are fast filling up, but it has not yet shaken off its past. A certain indefinable, delicious aroma from the old, ignorant, picturesque times lingers still, not only in byways and corners, but in the very centers of its newest activities. One would not, could not, truly know Los Angeles," she declared, "unless they could penetrate the outward reserve of, quote, the last few remaining survivors of the old Spanish and Mexican regime." It's also quaint, if quaint is allowed as a synonym for ugly and dismissive, even racist. The city grows up around and on top of all this, and the 1880s celebrates what they're building. It's a remarkable image from 1888. It shows how ambitious and urban the place is getting rapidly. This is Temple and Spring in downtown LA. This is the courthouse in 1888, and then my favorite is the Hall of Records, the large white building. How I would love to hop aboard a time machine and get in there. But long since gone, and alas, I'm sure many of the records that filled that very, very large building gone as well. Now, that said, all that dissonance and ugliness, there are other voices, maybe sotto voce, hard to hear in this same era. There's the merest suggestion of racial admixture in a positive sense in some of these observations. Some notion that the diversity of peoples in greater Los Angeles might just provide some kind of bulwark against, I'm not sure what. This is perhaps carrying the notion too far, especially since little mention is made after these voices are spoken. But, not to pick on the Historical Society too much, here's a positive ring of it. E.W. Jones, president of the Society in 1888, 1889, felt it. "The blending of the races here is a theme of great significance," he wrote. "It seems at first sight as if the pioneer race, who brought the arts of civilization to these shores, is being extinguished by the flood of immigration which has prevailed for the last few years." It's a little hard to parse that one out because it may not be as praiseworthy as we might see. It's complicated, I suspect. "The blood of these adventurous people," Jones said, "strong in body and mind, still coursing through the veins of thousands among us, will not fail to tell powerfully upon the final homogeneous race which is to occupy this region." Perhaps it was all an exercise in dissonance and deliberately poor memory. Yet read one way, Jones's comments are a brash call for healthy multiculturalism in a late 20th, early 21st century way. He later congratulated Southern California's mixed and fraternized races for creating a population marked by, in his words, manhood, patriotism, and ability. This is a rare observation, I think, to be sure, intellectually tantalizing precisely because it stands out in such a, brash way from brash relief from the historical record. I think most Angelenos Anglo-Saxon, white Angelenos, remained perfectly content in their 1880s belief that non-Anglo races could not compete and would then just slip away. As one observer saw it, Mexicans lurking in the, quote, obscure corners on the, quote, edges of the displacing civilization were simply disappearing as if a blight had fallen upon them. So flipping the healthy climate to do racial work. Or at least they would be outnumbered and hence rendered nearly unseen. The old-time Spanish settlements found here and there appear like islands in a sea of American progress, one pamphlet aimed at tourists declared. The Los Angeles of 1888 sells its can-do attitude. It sells its promise. It sells literally and figuratively its space. We must remember that the present density of the region in which we live is largely an historical accident, very much at odds with earlier assumptions, even certainties, about its lack of density. The trolley systems, and they're around this early, although often pulled by all those horses, and the ethos of the region once worked together to create a different kind of metropolis, one in which suburban satellites did not necessarily radiate from a single urban center, but instead often had their own industrial, manufacturing, or even agricultural mini-hubs in close proximity to residential development. In a famous phrase, Carrie McWilliams wrote, "If ever a region lived and planned for the future, that region is Southern California." In other words, that chestnut here about the lack of planning isn't right. Los Angeles in the 1880s grew as a spread out place, deliberately, as so many suburban plums in a fruitcake, as Cecil B. DeMille put it. And you can see that already shaping up in the late 1880s around the great excitement of the single-family home put out into those suburban landscapes. Los Angeles looks the way it does in large part because of the trajectory created by the real estate excitement of the latter 1880s. Inexpensive homes spread out in suburban tracts self-consciously and advertised as something not quite rural and not quite urban, but suburban, with as today also the attractions of what they won't call it, but we will, multimodal transportation. Los Angeles is a bicycle crazy place in the 1880s. It may be the most per capita-wise bicycle crazy urban metropolis in America. There are bicycle races. This is a team that won a race in 1888 with a young Kinney, who I didn't do my homework. I'm wondering if that's an Abbott Kinney progeny. A young Kinney is one of the team members of the bicycle races. So bicycling to connect in a web that accompanies the trolleys, bicycling moving around the landscape is a very, very much powerful 1880s phenomenon here. Metropolization also moved Los Angeles. During the years of discussion here today, Los Angeles does move. Not so much seismically, although that probably happens too, but geographically and cartographically. In the early 1880s, Los Angeles was still in the American Southwest. It was described in southwestern terms, related to climate, history, population, and was said by many to retain its feeling as a southwestern place and culture, inextricably tied to race, which is complicatedly being pulled apart in the period as well. But that's even as our story begins here today in 1888, starting to change. It's as if Los Angeles, in the midst of its romantic love affair with the Mission, anticipates the metropolitan skyline and transfers its love from A to B. In the late 1880s, Los Angeles municipal and residential growth began to earnestly pull the city northwest away from the plaza. There's some opposition to this, most glaringly by Charles Fletcher Lummis, whom you can't give a talk about Los Angeles in the 1880s without him appearing somewhere and demanding to be put in the text. Lummis arrived in the 1880s, claimed to have invented the term Southwest, may have. Writer, publisher, editor, photographer, city librarian. I'll recognize his granddaughter in the audience. Suzanne, where are you? Suzanne Lummis in the audience. Writer, publisher, editor, photographer, city librarian. He kept himself insanely busy for about 40 years, spreading the word about Southwestern culture and ideas from a home base, mostly in Los Angeles. It's exceedingly interesting to me that he leaves this place in 1888 for New Mexico, where he's probably more in Southwestern home and comfort than what he sees happening in Los Angeles. He'll come back, but it's quixotic, his hope to maintain Los Angeles in the Southwest he knew. It becomes global, it becomes metropolitan, such that the home he eventually builds on the 110 is a kind of sad, beautiful, remarkably interesting architecturally place, but a kind of sad loss about his hopes for what this place could be. Amid and woven through all this boosterism and exuberance and brashness are inevitably deeper themes that allow us to let the past, without hindsight's shackles, I think, guide us to better understand our world. Even a cursory look through some prognostications, and that's one thing I'll say about 1888, they love, the boosters, the journalists, the writers, the visitors, the memoirists, the letter writers, the postcard writers, love to look at this place and prognosticate about the future. It's going to be this, it's going to be that. It's part of the exuberance of the era. Even a cursory look at some of these suggests that we ought to launch a full-scale survey of all that this year tells us in its own voice. It's a voluble year of pronouncements about what this basin, metropolis, and place will be. For instance, 1888. The fact cannot be too frequently insisted upon that many sections of Southern California are equally attractive as summer or winter resorts. There are not, on the average, this statement says, 6 days in a year of over 90-degree temperatures in Los Angeles. In 2018, we had 8 of those days alone in July. 1888, quote, "The visitor to Los Angeles will find a noticeable and pleasant absence of such insect pests as mosquitoes and bedbugs, which render life at some of the eastern resorts a protracted torment. 2018, we live in an era of West Nile virus and mosquito-borne illnesses of resistant nimbleness. 1888, on the water supply spread out across the city's 6 water districts. The supply seems practically exhaustless. Engineers say there's enough for the whole city. 2018, not so. Decidedly not so." Or this line about the presumed relative ease with which the city authorities dealt with, in 1888 nomenclature, quote, "an assortment of vags and DPs, vagrants and displaced persons, coming up for sentence. Homelessness as a crime, fines levy, expediency as problem solving. 2018, a human tragedy in our streets of a scale previously unknown." Now, history's not a tool by which to gloat and say you got it wrong. We don't chortle and say how wrong they were about this, heat and water, mosquitoes and the homeless. We need to wonder why they believed what they did and what's changed, how we think today, or what and how we measure what we do, and how then has become now. History teaches. I want this 88 Los Angeles past to feel more familiar than it does. Just from my pointy head advantage, I can feel it slipping away from our time. Or at least I mostly want that. The only way to get there, probably, is immersion down the hall with my friends in special collections in more sources, more pictures, your attics, your garages, your closets, more maps, more records, to interview the past with the few things that's left for us. It's a slow process. It's a lifetime or lifetimes process, finding things, thinking about them, putting them next to or in dialogue with other things. Trying to put ourselves into the shoes of those who lived through all this rapid change of the latter 19th century. Trying to think in terms absent cars, planes, or any and all of what the 20th century brought with it. I long to make that more fluent in my life, not least because the past is intrinsically a fascinating place to go off to and think with. And yes, absolutely a refuge at times from the present or contemplation of the future. But I guess I don't want it to ever get too familiar, which of course it won't. The enduring mysteries of the past will ever be unanswerable, or at least ever be unanswerable perfectly, and that's okay with me. So for instance, with all the imagery here that I'm drawn to that's illustrative and point-making, I'm drawn to images like this. Los Angeles in 1888 has maybe 1,000 African Americans. Unidentified, I'm sure a fascinating backstory, 1888 portrait by a fine portrait photographer in downtown Los Angeles. Probably possible to find out more about this man. Maybe not. 1888 was brash in Los Angeles, but brash and indecipherable coexist. Brash and indecipherable coexist in the Los Angeles of that year, and of course ours, and in our understanding of both. And that feels okay to me. Thanks very much.